You didn't just plan to murder the king, you volunteered to light the fuse yourself. Welcome back to Brutal History for Sleep, where your crimes are always tucked in neatly before bed. If these quiet little betrayals help you rest, please like, subscribe, and whisper your sins in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from, and what time of night treason usually creeps into your thoughts. Tonight, you pledge loyalty to a Catholic uprising, tunnel beneath Parliament, and pack it with enough gunpowder to erase half the government before someone rats you out by letter. Close your eyes. The fire crackles softly beside you. Your breath is warm beneath the blanket. Nothing moves now, except the slow coil of guilt twisting beneath your ribs. You're sinking, gently, into stillness, into silence, into memory. And there it is, damp brick, a sulphur stink, and barrels stacked in the dark. The cellar glows with torchlight, your boots scrape the stone floor as you pace, counting down to justice, or to murder, or maybe to both. Upstairs, England sleeps, and you wait below, with the match and the cause and the quiet certainty that no one will stop you. Not yet. There's something particularly soothing about a man who dedicated his entire life to a single catastrophic failure. Guy Fawkes spent years planning, plotting, and preparing for one glorious moment of destruction, only to be caught red-handed in a basement, holding a fuse he never got to light. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Every spectacular failure begins with perfectly ordinary circumstances, and Guy Fawkes was nothing if not ordinary at first. The year was 1570, and York was the kind of place where nothing much happened, which made it perfect for raising children who would later try to blow up governments. The city sat comfortably in the north of England, far enough from London to avoid royal attention, but close enough to Catholic Scotland to maintain a healthy suspicion of religious extremism. It was a merchant town, populated by solid Protestant families who attended church regularly, paid their taxes promptly, and minded their own business, with the dedication of people who understood that minding other people's business could be dangerous. Edward Fawkes worked as a proctor in the ecclesiastical courts, essentially a religious bureaucrat who spent his days ensuring that Protestant England stayed Protestant. A steady job, really. Nothing revolutionary about pushing paperwork for the Church of England. His duties involved investigating reports of Catholic activity, pursuing recusants who refused to attend Protestant services, and generally maintaining the kind of religious conformity that made Tudor administrators sleep peacefully at night. Edward was good at his work because he believed in it completely. He'd grown up during the tumultuous years when England had switched from Catholic to Protestant to Catholic and back to Protestant again, depending on which monarch happened to be alive at any given moment. By the time Elizabeth settled the religious question in favour of Protestantism, Edward was thoroughly convinced that religious stability was worth whatever enforcement it required. Edward married Edith, a sensible Protestant woman from a respectable Protestant family. They had a son they named Guy, and settled into the comfortable rhythm of middle-class Protestant life. Their house on Stonegate was modest but respectable, furnished with the kind of solid English furniture that suggested prosperity without ostentation. They attended St. Michael le Belfray regularly, contributed to church maintenance, and raised their son to be a good Protestant Englishman. Young Guy learned his letters, said his prayers, and attended St. Peter's School in York alongside other sons of respectable Protestant families. Among his classmates were the Wright brothers, John and Jack, who would later join him in his spectacular career change from law-abiding citizen to domestic terrorist. Also in his class was Oswald Tesimond, who would become a Jesuit priest and secret supporter of the Gunpowder Plot. But at age 8, Guy was simply a quiet boy, who listened when adults spoke and never caused trouble. St. Peter's School was run by John Pullin, a man whose religious convictions were considerably more flexible than his employment suggested. Pullin had been educated at Oxford during the Catholic revival under Mary Tudor, and while he dutifully taught Protestant doctrine to his young charges, he occasionally allowed himself subtle comments about the beauties of Catholic theology and the unfortunate necessity of religious conformity. Guy absorbed these comments with the intense attention of a child who'd learned that adults rarely said what they really meant. While other boys focused on Latin grammar and arithmetic, Guy found himself thinking about the differences between what people believed and what they were required to say they believed. It was an early lesson in the complexity of religious politics, taught by a master who understood exactly how dangerous such complexity could be. The boy's education continued at home, where Edward Fawkes discussed his work with the casual confidence of a man who assumed his son would follow him into religious administration. Guy learned about the mechanics of religious enforcement, how Catholic priests were identified, how recusant families were tracked, how the elaborate network of informants and investigators maintained Protestant conformity throughout the kingdom. These weren't abstract lessons about good government or religious truth. These were practical instructions in the business of persecution, delivered by a father who genuinely believed he was protecting England from foreign subversion and domestic treachery. Edward showed his son the warrants he served, the fines he collected, and the reports he filed. He explained how Catholic networks operated, how they concealed their activities, and how persistent investigation could uncover even the most careful conspiracies. Guy found these lessons fascinating, though perhaps not in the way his father intended. While Edward saw Catholic resistance as evidence of foreign plotting and domestic disloyalty, Guy began to see it as evidence of remarkable courage and impressive organisation. The Catholics his father pursued weren't defeated, they were patient. They weren't broken, they were underground, they weren't surrendering, they were waiting. Then, in 1579, Edward Fawkes died. Death, as it tends to do, changed everything. Edith mourned appropriately, then did what any practical widow would do: she remarried. Her choice was interesting, and would prove to be historically significant in ways that no one could have anticipated. Dennis Bainbridge was Catholic. Not secretly Catholic, not conveniently Catholic, but defiantly, unapologetically Catholic. The kind of Catholic who refused to attend Protestant services, paid the hefty recusancy fines, and considered every Sunday service at the local Anglican church a betrayal of his immortal soul. Bainbridge was also wealthy, which made his religious defiance considerably more sustainable than it would have been for poorer Catholics. He owned property, conducted business with Protestant merchants who valued his money more than his religious opinions, and maintained the kind of social standing that provided some protection against the worst forms of persecution. He could afford to be Catholic in Protestant England because he could afford the consequences. This presented young Guy with a theological puzzle that would shape the rest of his life. His father had worked for the Protestant establishment, serving writs on Catholic recusants and investigating reports of illegal Catholic activity. His stepfather was exactly the kind of Catholic that his father had spent his career pursuing. Most children might have found this confusing. Guy found it fascinating. Dennis Bainbridge didn't simply believe in Catholicism, he lived it with the intensity of a man who knew he was surrounded by enemies. He maintained a private chapel in his house, staffed by priests who moved through Yorkshire in disguise. He corresponded with Catholic exiles on the continent, receiving news of Catholic victories in foreign wars and Catholic suffering in English prisons. He contributed money to Catholic causes, sheltered Catholic fugitives, and participated in the kind of underground religious network that his stepson's father had spent his career trying to destroy. More importantly, Bainbridge was willing to discuss these activities with his new stepson. Perhaps he saw in Guy's careful attention and thoughtful questions the makings of a future Catholic convert. Perhaps he simply enjoyed having someone who listened without judgment to his stories of Catholic martyrdom and Protestant persecution. Whatever his motivation, Bainbridge provided Guy with an education in Catholic resistance that would prove far more influential than anything he'd learned at St. Peter's School. He told stories of Catholic martyrs who died rather than renounce their faith, describing their courage in terms that made Protestant officials seem like bullying cowards rather than religious defenders. He spoke of Catholic priests who slipped through England in disguise, celebrating illegal masses in hidden rooms and maintaining the true faith despite impossible odds. He described a world where faith wasn't just personal belief, but a cause worth dying for, and where religious conviction required action rather than mere attendance at approved services. Guy listened. He listened to everything. The stories Bainbridge told weren't abstract tales of ancient saints or foreign heroes. They were contemporary accounts of English Catholics who were suffering and dying for their faith, while Guy's neighbours attended Protestant services and pretended religious controversies didn't exist. Father Edmund Campion had been executed just 2 years before Edward Fawkes died, tortured and killed for celebrating Catholic masses and refusing to recognise Elizabeth's religious authority. His death had been celebrated by Protestant officials as evidence of divine justice and government efficiency. Bainbridge described it as judicial murder. At St. Peter's School, Guy's education continued under Protestant auspices, but his real learning happened at home. Bainbridge introduced him to other Catholic families, the quiet ones who paid their fines and kept their heads down, and the louder ones who spoke of better days when England had been properly Catholic. These weren't abstract theological discussions conducted by scholars in comfortable libraries. These were war councils. The Catholic families Guy met through his stepfather lived as an occupied population in their own country. They developed elaborate codes for communicating safely, created hidden spaces in their homes for concealing priests and religious artifacts, and maintained networks of mutual support that operated parallel to official society. They had their own schools, their own marriage arrangements, their own economic relationships, and their own political loyalties. Young Guy discovered that being Catholic in Protestant England wasn't just about different prayers and rituals. It was about being part of an underground resistance that maintained its own culture, its own leadership, and its own hopes for eventual victory. Catholic families hid priests in secret chambers built into their homes, constructed with sliding panels and concealed entrances that could fool even experienced investigators. They passed coded messages about safe houses and sympathetic magistrates, using merchants and travellers to carry information across the country. They lived as exiles in their own country, always watching for informants, and always planning for the day when things might change. The technical aspects of this underground existence fascinated Guy almost as much as its religious motivation. He learned how secret chambers were constructed, how coded messages were written, how suspicious visitors could be identified and dangerous situations avoided. He discovered that successful resistance required not just courage and faith, but careful planning and technical expertise. The Catholics who survived weren't just the most devout, they were the most competent. By the time Guy reached his teens, he wasn't just absorbing Catholic theology. He was absorbing Catholic grievance, Catholic technique, and Catholic ambition. Every fine his family paid for missing Protestant services reminded him that his stepfather was being punished for his religious beliefs. Every story of a Catholic priest discovered and executed demonstrated that his co-religionists were being killed for their faith. Every celebration of Protestant victories over Catholic nations suggested that his religious community was under siege by hostile foreign powers, as well as domestic persecution. The young man who emerged from this education was not the kind of Catholic who simply wanted religious tolerance or peaceful coexistence. He was the kind of Catholic who wanted religious revolution, and who was prepared to work for it with the same technical competence and careful planning that his stepfather's generation had used for religious survival. Guy inherited his father's estate when he reached 21 in 1591, a respectable inheritance that made him financially independent and provided the resources necessary for whatever career he chose to pursue. He could have followed his father into religious administration, serving the Protestant establishment with the same bureaucratic efficiency that had supported his childhood. He could have followed his stepfather into Catholic resistance, maintaining the underground networks and secret practices that preserved Catholic culture in Protestant England. Instead, he sold it all. Every acre, every building, every reminder of his Protestant childhood, and his Catholic stepfather's careful compromises. The money would fund his real education, and it wouldn't be happening in York. It wouldn't be happening in England at all. His transformation from Guy to Guido began with a simple decision that would prove to be historically significant. England was the problem, and England's enemies might be the solution. Catholic Spain was at war with Protestant Netherlands. Catholic Spain despised Protestant England. Catholic Spain needed soldiers who understood the enemy, spoke the language, and possessed the kind of religious motivation that made them reliable allies in the great struggle between Catholic and Protestant Europe. Guy Fawkes said goodbye to his mother and stepfather, packed his few belongings, and headed for the continent. He had no military experience, no connections in Spanish service, and no plan beyond offering his services to whoever was fighting Protestants most enthusiastically. What he did have was something far more valuable than experience or connections: absolute certainty that he was right, unlimited patience for long-term planning, and the technical competence necessary to turn religious conviction into practical action. The journey across the English Channel took only hours, but it carried Guy Fawkes into an entirely different world. In Spain, Catholics weren't fined for their faith. They ruled nations. In the Spanish Netherlands, Catholic armies fought Protestant rebels in proper battles with proper weapons. And in the Spanish military, Englishmen who understood Protestant weaknesses, spoke the Protestant language, and possessed detailed knowledge of Protestant society were very welcome indeed. Guy arrived in the Low Countries in 1593, as England's government was debating new fines for Catholic recusants and new restrictions on Catholic activity. He would return years later as Guido Goes, veteran soldier and expert in things that exploded. His quiet childhood in York had taught him to listen carefully and plan thoroughly. His Catholic stepfather had taught him that faith required action rather than mere belief. Spain would teach him everything else, including how to kill people efficiently and how to destroy buildings completely. The transformation was remarkably simple. Take one reasonably intelligent Protestant boy, add Catholic grievance and underground education, mix with military training and international experience, and wait. The result was a man who would spend the rest of his life trying to solve England's religious problems with gunpowder, because obviously, nothing settles theological disputes quite like explosions. Spain in the 1590s was a delightful place for ambitious young Catholics with violent tendencies and flexible morals. The Spanish Empire was still pretending to be the greatest power in Europe. Philip II was still pretending that the Armada had been a strategic retreat rather than a catastrophic defeat, and Spanish generals were always happy to welcome English Catholics who wanted to fight their former countrymen. Guy Fawkes, now calling himself Guido, fit perfectly into this world of religious warfare and international conspiracy. The transition from Protestant England to Catholic Spain was jarring in ways that Guido found deeply satisfying. In England, Catholics worshipped in secret, paid fines for their faith, and lived as barely tolerated minorities in their own country. In Spain, Catholicism was the foundation of imperial power, the justification for foreign conquest, and the organizing principle of a society that saw itself as the defender of true Christianity against Protestant heresy and Muslim infidelity. Spanish society in the 1590s was organized around the concept of religious war. The Reconquista had ended barely a century earlier, with the final expulsion of Muslim rulers from the Iberian Peninsula. The conquest of the Americas was producing enormous wealth that funded Catholic armies throughout Europe. The Inquisition maintained religious orthodoxy with the kind of thorough efficiency that Protestant England could only envy. Spain was what England would become if Catholics regained power. A militarized, theocratic state dedicated to the proposition that religious truth justified any amount of violence. Guido's arrival in the Spanish Netherlands coincided with one of the most complex and brutal religious wars in European history. The 80 Years' War between Spain and the Dutch Republic had begun as a dispute over taxation and local autonomy, but had evolved into a fundamental conflict between Catholic authoritarianism and Protestant independence. Both sides fought with the conviction of people who believed their enemies were not just political opponents but theological abominations whose very existence threatened divine order. Military life suited him in ways that accounting for ecclesiastical courts never could have. Guido was tall, strong, and possessed the rare combination of absolute politeness and complete ruthlessness that Spanish officers found irresistible. He spoke softly, followed orders precisely, and never seemed bothered by the messier aspects of siege warfare. When other soldiers complained about the stench of decomposing enemies or the tedium of waiting for starvation to break a city's will, Guido simply shrugged and went about his business with the calm efficiency of a man who'd found his true calling. His business, as it turned out, was explosives. The Spanish army of the 1590s was arguably the most professional military organization in Europe, with a tactical sophistication and technical competence that made other armies look like armed mobs. Spanish engineers had perfected the science of siege warfare, developing mathematical approaches to fortress assault that reduced what had once been matters of courage and luck to problems of geometry and chemistry. Spanish artillery was the finest in the world, served by gunners who could calculate trajectories with scholarly precision. Spanish logistics supported campaigns that lasted for years and covered hundreds of miles. To this world of military professionalism stepped Guido Fawkes, who discovered that his Protestant childhood had provided him with exactly the skills that Spanish commanders valued most. He understood English military thinking because he'd grown up hearing his father discuss English defences. He spoke English without an accent because it was his native language. He knew English geography, English society, and English weaknesses because he'd lived them for 23 years. More importantly, he possessed the kind of religious motivation that made him completely trustworthy in Spanish service. Spanish officers dealt constantly with mercenaries who fought for money, adventurers who fought for excitement, and political exiles who fought for personal revenge. Guido fought for God, which made him both more reliable and more dangerous than any of these other categories. The 80 Years' War between Spain and the Dutch Republic was a delightfully complicated affair, where Catholic Spanish forces tried to convince Protestant Dutch rebels that independence was overrated. Since the Dutch disagreed, both sides settled into the kind of prolonged, expensive, utterly pointless conflict that made military careers and destroyed treasuries. Cities changed hands repeatedly, provinces declared independence and were reconquered. Armies marched back and forth across the same territories, laying siege to the same fortifications and fighting the same battles, with the grim persistence of people who'd forgotten what they were originally fighting about. Guido thrived in this environment of technical complexity and theological certainty. He learnt to dig tunnels under enemy fortifications, calculating exactly where to place charges for maximum effect. He studied the precise mathematics of destruction, how much powder to collapse a tower, how much to merely crack a wall, how much to turn a garrison into airborne fragments. Other soldiers learned swordplay and cavalry charges. Guido learned chemistry, engineering, and the patient arts of siege warfare. His Spanish colleagues appreciated his technical skills, but they were even more impressed by his motivation. Most mercenaries fought for money and went home when their contracts expired. Most volunteers fought for glory and lost interest when the campaigning became routine. Guido fought with the patient intensity of a man settling a personal score that could only be resolved by the complete destruction of his enemies. The technical education Guido received in Spanish service was remarkably comprehensive. Spanish military engineers were among the most advanced in Europe, trained in mathematics, surveying, and the emerging science of ballistics. They understood the principles of leverage, the chemistry of gunpowder, and the geometry of fortification with a precision that made their sieges models of scientific efficiency. Guido learned to calculate the amount of gunpowder needed to bring down walls of different thicknesses and compositions. He studied how to dig tunnels that approached enemy fortifications without being detected, how to shore up underground passages to prevent collapse, and how to time multiple explosions for maximum psychological as well as physical effect. He practiced with different types of fuses, different grades of gunpowder, and different methods of packing explosive charges for optimal destruction. When Spanish forces recaptured Calais from the French in 1596, Guido wasn't celebrating another victory for Catholic Spain. He was taking notes for future reference. The siege had demonstrated advanced techniques for mining fortifications, timing coordinated attacks, and managing the complex logistics of prolonged siege warfare. More importantly, it had shown how relatively small groups of well-trained specialists could achieve effects far beyond what their numbers would suggest. The victory at Calais was particularly satisfying because it involved defeating French forces that were allied with Protestant England. For Guido, this wasn't just another military campaign, it was practice for his real target. Every fortress he helped capture, every wall he helped destroy, every Protestant enemy he helped kill was preparation for the much more ambitious project he was already planning. Because Guido Fawkes hadn't come to the Netherlands to serve Spain indefinitely, he'd come to learn how to destroy England. His fellow English Catholic exiles understood this perfectly. The Spanish court was full of Englishmen who'd fled Elizabeth's persecution, and they spent their days planning elaborate schemes to restore Catholic rule to their homeland. Some plotted to assassinate Elizabeth and replace her with Mary Queen of Scots or some other Catholic claimant. Others planned to land Spanish armies on English beaches, using their knowledge of English geography and English defences to guide foreign invasions. A few even suggested poisoning England's water supply or burning London, which showed impressive ambition if questionable understanding of logistics. These English exiles formed a community of shared grievance and common purpose that provided Guido with both social support and practical education. They told him about Catholic networks that still operated in England, about sympathetic nobles who might support a Catholic restoration, about strategic locations that would be crucial in any attempt to overthrow the Protestant government. They shared intelligence about English military preparations, English political divisions, and English vulnerabilities. More importantly, they provided Guido with a realistic assessment of what previous Catholic plots had accomplished, which was essentially nothing. Assassination attempts had failed because they targeted individuals rather than institutions. Invasion plans had failed because they required defeating the English navy, which had proven surprisingly competent at defending English waters. Schemes for popular uprising had failed because English Catholics were too few, too scattered, and too closely watched to organize effective resistance. Guido listened to all these plans with the polite attention of a professional evaluating amateur efforts. Then he began developing his own ideas, based on his growing expertise in siege warfare and his detailed understanding of English society. The problem with most schemes to overthrow the English government was that they were either too complicated or too small. Assassinating Elizabeth might remove one Protestant monarch, but it wouldn't eliminate the Protestant establishment that would simply install another Protestant ruler. Landing armies required defeating the English navy and establishing beachheads against organised resistance, which demanded resources that Catholic Spain could barely afford. Poisoning water supplies was theoretically elegant but practically impossible, given the logistics of 16th century urban infrastructure. What England's Catholics needed wasn't another martyr or another failed invasion. They needed something that would remove the entire Protestant power structure in a single stroke. Something dramatic enough to inspire a general Catholic uprising. Something so shocking that it would paralyze Protestant resistance long enough for Spanish forces to land and restore the proper order. Something that would demonstrate to English Catholics that their oppressors were not invincible, and to Spanish commanders that English conquest was achievable. Guido's solution was characteristically direct. Blow up the government, all of it, at once. The idea wasn't entirely original. Guy Fawkes wasn't the first person to notice that governments occasionally gathered in large groups, creating convenient targets for anyone with sufficient explosives and sufficient motivation. But he was among the first to approach the problem with genuine military expertise and unlimited patience. While other conspirators talked about quick strikes and dramatic gestures, Guido calculated exactly how much gunpowder would be needed to level the Houses of Parliament, how such explosives could be positioned for maximum effect, and how the resulting chaos could be exploited for political advantage. His timing couldn't have been better. Elizabeth died in 1603, and James I took the throne with promises of religious tolerance that he promptly ignored. England's Catholics briefly hoped for better treatment under a king whose mother had been Catholic and whose commitment to Protestant orthodoxy seemed less fanatical than Elizabeth's. Instead, they got increased fines, stricter enforcement, and growing pressure to conform to religious requirements that many found impossible to accept. This was exactly the environment Guido had been waiting for. English Catholics were angry, desperate, and increasingly willing to consider extreme solutions to problems that seemed to have no peaceful resolution. Spanish officials were happy to support any plan that might destabilize Protestant England and create opportunities for Catholic restoration. And Guido himself had spent nearly a decade learning precisely how to make very large things fall down very quickly. When Thomas Winter arrived in Spain in 1604, seeking Spanish support for a Catholic uprising in England, he found Guido Fawkes waiting with a proposal that was breathtaking in its simplicity and terrifying in its scope. Not another attempt to convert England's rulers or replace them with foreign armies. Not another scheme for popular uprising or foreign invasion. Something much more direct, much more final, and much more likely to succeed. They would eliminate England's entire Protestant leadership in a single day. Parliament, monarchy, bishops, judges, everyone who mattered would be in the House of Lords for the state opening of Parliament. One enormous explosion would remove every obstacle to Catholic restoration. The surviving Catholics would take control, invite in Spanish forces, and restore England to the true faith before Protestant resistance could organise. Winter listened to this plan with the enthusiasm of a man who'd spent years watching subtler schemes fail completely. Guido presented it with the calm confidence of a professional soldier discussing routine tactics. Neither man seemed particularly concerned that they were planning the most audacious act of terrorism in European history, or that success would require a level of technical competence and operational security that had rarely been achieved in any previous conspiracy. They shook hands, finalised the details, and prepared to return to England. Guido packed his belongings, said farewell to his Spanish colleagues, and prepared to embark on the project that would define his legacy. He'd spent a decade learning to destroy fortifications in service of Catholic Spain. Now he would use those skills to destroy the Protestant establishment in service of Catholic England, though he would revert to calling himself Guy Fawkes once he returned to his homeland, Spanish names being somewhat conspicuous in Jacobean London. The plan was perfect. The motivation was pure. The technical expertise was proven. The funding was secured. The international support was guaranteed. The target was predictable, accessible, and sufficiently concentrated to ensure complete success. The timing was ideal, with English Catholics at their most desperate and Spanish support at its most reliable. What could possibly go wrong? Planning to blow up the entire English government required exactly the kind of meticulous attention to detail that most people reserve for wedding arrangements or tax preparation. Unfortunately, the Gunpowder Plot conspirators approached their task with all the organisational skills of a village harvest festival committee, which is to say, they meant well, but couldn't seem to agree on anything important, and definitely couldn't keep their mouths shut. The plot began sensibly enough, which should have been everyone's first warning that it would end catastrophically. Robert Catesby, a charming Catholic gentleman with more passion than sense, and considerably more debt than either, gathered 4 trusted friends in a London tavern in May 1604 and proposed the obvious solution to England's Protestant problem: eliminate everyone in charge all at once with explosives. His audience, Thomas Winter, Jack Wright, Thomas Percy, and Guy Fawkes, nodded approvingly, apparently under the impression that terrorism was like accounting, complex in theory but straightforward in practice. They swore an oath of secrecy with the solemnity of men who genuinely believed they could keep 13 people quiet about the most explosive secret in English history. They took communion together, asking God to bless their endeavour to commit mass murder in his name. Then they began planning the most complicated act of domestic terrorism in English history, with the confidence of people who'd never actually organised anything more complex than a dinner party. Their target was perfect, which was the only aspect of the entire conspiracy that actually worked as intended. The state opening of Parliament brought together the King, both Houses of Parliament, the bishops, the judges, and everyone else who mattered in a single building at a predictable time on a known date. One well-placed explosion would remove the entire Protestant establishment and leave England leaderless, confused, and ready for Catholic restoration. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity and impossible in its execution. The execution was another matter entirely, beginning with the small problem that none of the conspirators had any practical experience with large-scale construction projects, underground excavation, or industrial quantities of gunpowder. They were gentlemen, which meant they were accustomed to having other people do actual work while they supervised from a safe distance and complained about the results. First, they needed access to the Houses of Parliament, which proved surprisingly easy to arrange. Thomas Percy, being a gentleman pensioner with court connections and an impressive talent for maintaining his social position despite his treasonous inclinations, managed to lease a house conveniently located next to the building they intended to destroy. The conspirators congratulated themselves on this stroke of luck and began digging a tunnel from Percy's cellar toward the foundation of the House of Lords. The tunnel proved more challenging than expected, which came as a complete surprise to men who'd apparently never dug anything deeper than a flower bed. None of the conspirators had extensive mining experience, and London's soil was considerably harder than they'd anticipated. The ground beneath Westminster consisted of dense clay mixed with centuries of accumulated debris, which required tools they didn't have and skills they couldn't acquire without attracting attention. They worked in shifts, hauling dirt in baskets, and trying to maintain their cover as respectable gentlemen who certainly weren't burrowing toward the seat of government with destructive intent. The work was back-breaking, the progress was minimal, and the noise was increasingly obvious to anyone who cared to investigate the strange sounds coming from Percy's cellar. Worse, they seemed to be digging in the wrong direction entirely, which suggested that their understanding of underground navigation was even worse than their understanding of soil composition. The tunnel project consumed months of effort and produced exactly enough excavation to demonstrate that the conspirators had no idea what they were doing. They'd managed to advance perhaps 15 feet in the general direction of Parliament, creating a passage that was too narrow, too low and too unstable to serve any useful purpose. The work was slow, noisy and increasingly obvious. Local residents began asking questions about the strange activities at Percy's house. The conspirators began asking questions about whether tunnel digging was really the most efficient approach to building demolition. Then fate intervened with the kind of coincidence that makes conspiracy theorists question everything, and practical men thank God for small favours. A cellar directly beneath the House of Lords became available for rent, offered by a woman who apparently saw nothing suspicious about gentlemen who wanted to store large quantities of coal and lumber in underground chambers during the summer months. Percy immediately leased it, and the conspirators abandoned their tunnel in favour of the much simpler plan of stacking gunpowder directly under their target. This should have been everyone's second warning that the conspiracy was doomed. Any plot that required such enormous strokes of luck was clearly not based on competent planning. The new cellar was perfect, spacious, convenient, and so close to the House of Lords that they could practically hear parliamentary debates through the ceiling. It had thick stone walls that would contain and direct an explosion upward, a vaulted ceiling that would focus the blast, and direct access from the street for convenient delivery of large quantities of explosive materials. It was, in short, exactly what they needed, which should have made them deeply suspicious about why it had become available at exactly the right moment. Guy Fawkes, being the explosives expert by virtue of his Spanish military service, calculated that 36 barrels of gunpowder would be sufficient to remove the building, and everyone in it, from the face of the earth. The others agreed this sounded reasonable, apparently under the impression that gunpowder calculations were simple arithmetic rather than complex chemistry, involving variables they didn't understand. Acquiring 36 barrels of gunpowder without attracting attention proved surprisingly easy, which should have been the third warning that their security was fundamentally compromised. England was at peace, but gunpowder was still readily available for legitimate purposes like mining, construction, and the various small wars that English gentlemen occasionally fought among themselves. The conspirators purchased their explosives in small lots from different suppliers, stored them in various locations around London, and gradually moved everything to the cellar beneath Parliament. Each transaction required explanations, documentation, and transportation arrangements that left trails any competent investigator could follow. Each delivery required labourers who saw the materials, drivers who knew the destinations, and merchants who remembered the customers. Each storage location required landlords who asked questions, neighbours who noticed activities, and servants who overheard conversations. By October 1605, they had assembled enough explosives to level half of Westminster, which represented either impressive dedication or dangerous obsession, depending on one's perspective. Guy Fawkes had volunteered to light the fuse and escape in the confusion, which showed either remarkable courage or remarkable optimism about his chances of survival. The other conspirators planned to seize key strongholds around London, proclaim a Catholic government, and welcome Spanish armies that would presumably arrive at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right resources, to capitalise on the chaos. The plan was progressing beautifully, which naturally meant it was about to fall apart completely in ways that would demonstrate how little the conspirators understood about conspiracy, security, or human nature. The first problem was secrecy, which the conspirators treated as a guideline rather than an absolute requirement. What had begun as a tight conspiracy of 5 men gradually expanded as the plotters realised they needed more resources, more connections, and more supporters for the chaos that would follow their spectacular opening act. They recruited Catesby's cousin, then Percy's friend, then Wintour's brother, then various other Catholic gentlemen who seemed trustworthy and properly motivated, but who had their own friends, relatives, and associates. Each new conspirator brought useful skills and necessary contacts. They also brought friends, relatives, and associates who knew something was being planned, even if they didn't know exactly what. Servants overheard conversations. Wives noticed unusual activities. Business partners asked questions about sudden financial transactions. Neighbours observed strange comings and goings at houses that had previously been quiet. By November, the conspiracy included 13 active plotters and an unknown number of sympathisers, servants and hangers-on, who suspected that certain Catholic gentlemen were up to something interesting. The secret that had begun with 5 men was now shared, in various forms and to various degrees, by dozens of people scattered across London and the surrounding counties. The second problem was timing, which proved to be far more flexible than the conspirators had anticipated. Parliament's opening had been delayed several times due to plague concerns, giving the conspirators more time to prepare, but also more opportunities for things to go wrong. Each delay meant more chances for someone to talk, more risks of discovery, and more strain on nerves that were already stretched thin by months of deception and preparation. The delays also meant that the conspirators had to maintain their cover stories for longer periods, continue their normal social activities while planning mass murder, and resist the temptation to hint at the great events that were about to unfold. Men who'd spent months preparing for the most important day of their lives found themselves waiting indefinitely for that day to arrive, with no guarantee that it would arrive at all. The third problem was conscience, which manifested itself in the form of Lord Monteagle, a Catholic peer with inconvenient relatives among the conspirators and an even more inconvenient sense of moral responsibility. In late October 1605, Monteagle received an anonymous letter warning him to avoid Parliament on November 5th. The letter was vague enough to maintain plausible deniability, but specific enough to save Monteagle's life if he took it seriously, which he did by showing it to the authorities. The letter read, "My lord, out of the love I bear to some of your friends, I have a care of your preservation. Therefore I would advise you, as you tender your life, to devise some excuse to shift your attendance at this Parliament. For God and man hath concurred to punish the wickedness of this time. And think not slightly of this advertisement, but retire yourself into your country, where you may expect the event in safety. For though there be no appearance of any stir, yet I say they shall receive a terrible blow, this Parliament, and yet they shall not see who hurts them." Even by the standards of anonymous threatening letters, this was remarkably unhelpful. It warned of danger without specifying what kind, suggested a terrible blow without mentioning explosives, and advised Monteagle to leave London without explaining why. Any sensible person would have ignored it as the work of a crank or someone seeking attention through vague threats. Unfortunately for the conspirators, Robert Cecil was not a sensible person. He was Elizabeth's former spymaster, James's current minister, and the kind of paranoid, methodical investigator who saw assassination plots in grocery lists and coded messages in dinner invitations. Cecil had spent his career assuming that Catholics were constantly plotting against the government, and this letter seemed to confirm his worst suspicions. When Monteagle brought him the letter, Cecil immediately began searching for whatever terrible blow was being planned. He ordered systematic searches of all government buildings, interviews with suspicious persons, and investigation of any unusual activities that might be connected to the vague threats in the anonymous warning. The search took exactly 1 day, which says something either about Cecil's investigative competence or about the conspirators' security procedures. On November 4th, Royal Guards examined the cellars beneath Parliament as part of routine security preparations. They found Guy Fawkes, alone in the dark, surrounded by 36 barrels of gunpowder, and carrying a length of slow match that would have made an excellent fuse. When challenged, Fawkes claimed his name was John Johnson and that he was Percy's caretaker, which explained his presence but not the barrels of explosives. He presented this story with the calm confidence of a man who'd clearly given this alias considerable thought, but who hadn't given equal thought to explaining why a caretaker would need so much gunpowder. The guards, being reasonably observant and adequately suspicious, arrested him immediately. They also seized the gunpowder, secured the cellar, and sent word to their superiors that they'd discovered either the most incompetent storage operation in London or the most dangerous terrorist plot in English history. The rest of the conspiracy collapsed with impressive speed. Some plotters fled London immediately, racing toward Midland strongholds, where they hoped to rally Catholic supporters for the uprising that was supposed to follow the explosion. Others barricaded themselves in country houses and prepared for siege. A few simply waited to be arrested, apparently too shocked by the sudden failure of their perfect plan to take any meaningful action. Guy Fawkes, meanwhile, was taken to the Tower of London for questioning. He would soon discover that Tudor interrogation techniques were considerably more sophisticated than Spanish military discipline, and far less pleasant than either. He would also discover that his co-conspirators' commitment to protecting his identity was considerably less absolute than his commitment to protecting theirs. The arrest of John Johnson, who was obviously not John Johnson, at 1 o'clock in the morning on November 5, 1605, must have been one of the more straightforward police investigations in English history. The suspect was found in a basement filled with explosives, carrying materials needed to light them, and positioned directly beneath the building he intended to destroy. Even by the standards of 17th century criminal justice, this was what legal scholars would call a slam-dunk case. Guy Fawkes, however, seemed determined to make things more complicated than necessary. When first questioned, he maintained his identity as John Johnson with the stubborn persistence of a man who'd clearly given this alias considerable thought. Yes, he was Thomas Percy's caretaker. Yes, he had legitimate business in the cellar. No, he couldn't explain the gunpowder, but surely that was Percy's concern, not his. He presented this story with such calm confidence that his interrogators might have believed him, if not for the small detail that he'd been discovered holding a fuse while standing next to enough explosives to remove Westminster from the map. The initial questioning was almost polite, conducted with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested his captors hadn't yet grasped the full scope of what they'd uncovered. King James had specifically requested that Johnson be examined gently at first, which, in early Stuart England, meant they would ask nicely before moving on to more persuasive techniques. Royal investigators wanted to understand exactly what had been planned, who else was involved, and whether this was part of a larger plot against the crown. Fawkes answered their questions with the courtesy of a professional soldier reporting to superior officers. He confirmed that the gunpowder was indeed intended to kill the king and destroy Parliament. He admitted that accomplices had helped with the preparations. He acknowledged that the plan was part of a broader scheme to restore Catholic rule to England. He even provided technical details about the explosive arrangements, demonstrating the kind of expertise that made his interrogators increasingly nervous about what they were dealing with. What he refused to do was provide names. This created an interesting problem for his interrogators. They clearly had the right man. His technical knowledge of explosives and detailed understanding of the plot left no doubt about his involvement, but they needed to identify his co-conspirators before those men could escape, organize additional attacks, or disappear into the Catholic underground that everyone knew existed, but no one could quite define. Polite questioning was producing useful information about the plot itself, but nothing about the plotters. Fawkes described the technical preparations with the precision of an engineer discussing a construction project. He explained the timing with the attention to detail of a clerk reviewing a schedule. He outlined the objectives with the clarity of a theologian presenting a logical argument. But when asked about names, locations, or financial arrangements, he simply smiled and changed the subject. His interrogators found this simultaneously admirable and infuriating. They were dealing with a man who'd planned to commit mass murder, but who possessed a code of honor that prevented him from betraying his associates. It was the kind of principled behavior that might have been praiseworthy in other circumstances, but which was decidedly inconvenient when national security was at stake. King James, displaying the kind of practical wisdom that had kept him alive through various assassination attempts in Scotland and England, authorized more intensive interrogation methods. The gentle approach was officially terminated, and Guy Fawkes was introduced to the persuasive techniques that made the Tower of London famous throughout Europe. Torture in early 17th century England was a carefully regulated process, conducted by trained professionals according to established procedures. The goal wasn't simple cruelty, it was extracting specific information as efficiently as possible. Investigators wanted names, locations, financial details, and foreign connections. They approached torture with the methodical precision of craftsmen practicing a specialized trade, using techniques that had been refined through generations of experience with uncooperative subjects. The Tower of London maintained a collection of devices designed to encourage truthfulness in reluctant witnesses. The rack was perhaps the most famous, a wooden frame that stretched subjects until their joints separated and their resolve collapsed. The scavenger's daughter compressed victims into impossibly small spaces until breathing became difficult and confession seemed preferable to suffocation. Thumb screws applied precisely calibrated pressure to sensitive extremities until pain overcame loyalty. Guy Fawkes proved remarkably resistant to their professional attentions. For 2 days he endured questioning, that began with threats and escalated through increasingly painful persuasion. His interrogators were experienced, patient, and creative. They explained exactly what information they needed and precisely what would happen if he continued to withhold it. They demonstrated their techniques on practice subjects to ensure he understood the stakes. They gave him multiple opportunities to cooperate voluntarily, before applying physical pressure. Fawkes refused every offer, rejected every threat, and endured every demonstration with the stoic determination of a man who'd made his peace with martyrdom years earlier. His Spanish military service had prepared him for the possibility of capture and interrogation. His Catholic faith assured him that suffering for the cause would be rewarded in the afterlife. His personal code of honor demanded that he protect his fellow conspirators, regardless of the cost to himself. His resistance was impressive, but not unlimited. The human body has finite capacity for pain, and Tudor interrogators understood exactly how to exploit that limitation. They applied pressure systematically, beginning with techniques that caused maximum discomfort with minimal permanent damage, then escalating to methods that produced results regardless of the subject's willpower. Unfortunately for Fawkes, his fellow conspirators weren't showing similar dedication to protecting him or themselves. While Guy Fawkes was demonstrating his impressive pain tolerance in the Tower of London, the rest of the plotters were fleeing, fighting, and dying with the kind of dramatic flair that made excellent propaganda for the Protestant government. Some had escaped London immediately after the discovery, racing to Midland strongholds where they hoped to rally Catholic supporters for the uprising that was supposed to follow the explosion. Others had remained in the city, apparently paralysed by the sudden collapse of their perfect plan. The fugitives didn't get far. On November 8th, Robert Catesby, Thomas Percy, and the Wright brothers barricaded themselves in Holbeach House and prepared for siege. They were joined by other Catholic gentlemen who'd heard rumours of a Catholic uprising and had come to volunteer for what they assumed would be a glorious restoration of the true faith. Instead, they got a brief, confused firefight that ended with most of the conspirators dead and the survivors captured. Catesby and Percy died in the assault, shot by the same musket ball in what Protestant propagandists would later describe as divine justice. The Wright brothers and several others were killed in the fighting. The few survivors were arrested and transported to London for interrogation that would prove considerably more successful than their dead colleagues' resistance. The siege at Holbeach House became the subject of ballads, sermons, and official reports that painted the conspirators as desperate fanatics who preferred death to capture. The reality was somewhat less heroic. The conspirators had run out of options, had no realistic plan for escape, and were facing professional soldiers who surrounded their position and possessed superior weapons. Their glorious last stand. There was actually a brief exchange of gunfire that ended when their ammunition ran low and their leaders were killed. News of the fugitives' deaths reached Guy Fawkes in his tower cell on November 8th, carried by interrogators who hoped the information might encourage him to cooperate. The last of his co-conspirators were dead or captured. The plot had failed completely. Spanish forces weren't coming to rescue him. Catholic supporters had shown no signs of rising in rebellion. The great cause for which he'd sacrificed everything had collapsed into a footnote in government security reports. His cause was lost, his friends were dead, and his suffering was accomplishing nothing except prolonging his own agony. On the same day, Guy Fawkes finally broke. The confession was comprehensive, detailed, and utterly damning. Fawkes provided names, dates, locations, and financial records. He described the plot's origins, explained the technical preparations, and identified every participant he could remember. He told his interrogators about Spanish support, Catholic sympathizers, and foreign connections. He drew diagrams of the cellar, calculated the explosive yield of their gunpowder stores, and provided a complete timeline of the conspiracy, from conception to discovery. Most importantly, he confirmed what the government most wanted to hear. This had been a Catholic conspiracy, supported by foreign enemies, aimed at destroying England's Protestant establishment. It wasn't the work of a few desperate men acting on personal grievances, but part of a broader campaign by international Catholicism against Protestant England. Whether this was entirely accurate was less important than its political utility. Guy Fawkes had provided exactly the kind of confession that would justify harsh measures against England's Catholic population and closer scrutiny of foreign Catholic powers. His torture had produced the propaganda that would define English attitudes toward Catholicism for generations. The confession was signed Guido Fawkes, in handwriting that showed the effects of his tower experience. His signature was shaky, cramped, and barely legible, a stark contrast to the confident script he'd used before his arrest. Even his name had changed under torture, reverting from the anglicised Guy to the Spanish Guido that he'd used during his military service. The reversion to his Spanish name was particularly significant to his interrogators, who saw it as confirmation that this had been a foreign plot rather than a domestic uprising. Guido Fawkes wasn't just an English Catholic with grievances against his government. He was a Spanish agent who'd returned to England with orders to destroy the Protestant establishment on behalf of Catholic Spain. With his confession complete and the other conspirators dead or captured, Guy Fawkes was returned to his cell to await trial. The legal proceedings would be swift, the outcome predetermined, and the sentence exactly what everyone expected for high treason against the crown. The government had its evidence, its propaganda, and its villains. All that remained was the formal process of justice. But Guy Fawkes had one final surprise prepared for his captors, his judges, and the crowd that would gather to watch his execution. He'd spent his adult life planning dramatic gestures and spectacular failures. His death would be both. The trial of Guy Fawkes and his surviving co-conspirators on January 27, 1606, was the kind of elaborate legal pageantry that early Stuart England did exceptionally well. Lots of ceremony, impeccable procedure, and an outcome that everyone knew before the proceedings began. The 8 surviving plotters were charged with high treason, which in 1606 carried the mandatory sentence of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. This was not a trial to determine guilt or innocence, but a formal process to ensure that justice was seen to be done with appropriate theatrical flair. Westminster Hall was packed with spectators, eager to see the men who'd tried to blow up the government. The building itself seemed to mock the defendants. They'd planned to destroy Parliament, and now they were being tried in Parliament's own ceremonial chamber. The defendants were arranged in a neat row, looking exactly like what they were, provincial gentlemen who'd gotten themselves into trouble far beyond their ability to handle. Guy Fawkes stood with the others, calm and composed, showing no signs of the torture that had extracted his confession months earlier. He'd recovered physically from his interrogation, though his signature still showed the effects of his tower experience. More importantly, he seemed to have recovered psychologically, displaying the kind of quiet dignity that suggested he'd made his peace with whatever was about to happen. The prosecution presented its case with the kind of overwhelming evidence that made defense attorneys consider career changes. They had signed confessions, detailed testimony, physical evidence, and witness statements that documented every aspect of the plot, from conception to discovery. They had diagrams of the cellar, samples of the gunpowder, and technical analysis of the explosive arrangements that demonstrated exactly how much of London would have been destroyed if the plan had succeeded. The defendants had no meaningful defence except to throw themselves on the mercy of the court, which everyone understood was purely a formality. Their guilt was established, their intentions were documented, and their methods were explained in excruciating detail. The only question was whether they would show appropriate repentance before receiving their inevitable sentences. Attorney General Sir Edward Coke delivered the kind of speech that would be quoted in legal textbooks for centuries. A masterpiece of righteous indignation that painted the defendants as agents of foreign powers, enemies of Protestant England, and threats to everything decent people held dear. He described their plot as devilish, their methods as hellish, and their goals as damnable. By the time he finished, the spectators were ready to carry out the executions themselves. Coke's speech was notable not just for its eloquence, but for its political sophistication. He connected the Gunpowder Plot to broader Catholic threats against Protestant England, linking the defendants to foreign conspiracies, domestic rebellions, and theological disputes that had plagued the kingdom for decades. The conspirators weren't just criminals, they were symbols of everything that threatened English independence and Protestant faith. The defendants were invited to speak in their own defence, though everyone understood this was primarily an opportunity for them to demonstrate proper repentance and beg for royal mercy. Most made brief statements expressing sorrow for their actions and hope for divine forgiveness. A few remained defiantly silent, apparently preferring dignity to futile appeals for clemency. Guy Fawkes offered a short speech that managed to be both apologetic and unapologetic. sorry for the attempt against the king's person, but not particularly sorry for trying to restore Catholic rule to England. He spoke with the calm precision of a man who'd had months to prepare his final statement, acknowledging his guilt while maintaining that his cause had been righteous, even if his methods had been wrong. His speech was carefully crafted to achieve multiple objectives: demonstrating respect for the king while maintaining loyalty to his faith, expressing regret for the plot while defending the principles that had motivated it, and preparing for martyrdom while avoiding the kind of defiant rhetoric that might provoke additional persecution of English Catholics. The verdict was unanimous and immediate: guilty of high treason. The sentence was traditional and specific. Each defendant would be drawn through the streets of London on a hurdle, hanged by the neck until nearly dead, cut down while still alive, disemboweled, beheaded and quartered. Their body parts would be displayed at locations throughout London as a warning to other potential traitors. This was the full horror show. Death as public entertainment, designed to satisfy the crowd's desire for justice, while demonstrating the crown's power to punish its enemies with creative brutality. The execution was scheduled for January 30th and 31st, 1606, giving London's residents plenty of time to plan their attendance at what promised to be the social event of the season. The sentence of hanging, drawing and quartering was carefully designed to maximize both physical suffering and symbolic impact. Traitors would be dragged through the streets to demonstrate their powerlessness, hanged until nearly dead to begin their punishment, then cut down for the real spectacle of disembowelment and dismemberment. The process could take hours if properly managed, providing ample entertainment for crowds while serving as an unforgettable warning to potential conspirators. Guy Fawkes and 3 others were scheduled to die on January 31st in Old Palace Yard, within sight of the Parliament building they'd tried to destroy. The location was carefully chosen for its symbolic value. The traitors would die where their treachery had been intended, allowing justice and irony to converge in a single spectacular moment. The crowd that gathered for the execution was enormous, enthusiastic and eager for entertainment. Public executions were among the few free spectacles available to London's population, and the Gunpowder Plot conspirators were celebrities. Street vendors sold food and drink to spectators who planned to spend the entire day watching justice being done. Pickpockets worked the crowd with the efficiency of professionals attending a business conference. Ballad singers performed songs about the plotters' crimes and punishments, providing both entertainment and historical commentary. The execution of the first 3 conspirators proceeded according to plan, with each man dying the full, gruesome death prescribed by law. The crowd cheered each stage of the proceedings and called for even greater cruelty, apparently under the impression that treason deserved not just death but theatrical suffering. By the time Guy Fawkes climbed the scaffold, the crowd had been watching executions for hours and had developed increasingly bloodthirsty expectations. Guy Fawkes was the last to mount the platform, and by the time his turn came, the crowd was fully warmed up and eager for the grand finale. They'd seen 3 men die slowly and horribly, and they wanted the 4th execution to be even more spectacular. The executioner was experienced, the crowd was bloodthirsty, and the procedure was precisely defined by law and tradition. Everything was prepared for another routine demonstration of royal justice, which was when Guy Fawkes decided to rob everyone of their entertainment. As the noose was placed around his neck and the executioner prepared to begin the lengthy process of his death, Guy Fawkes jumped. Not jumped down from the scaffold, jumped up, putting his full weight on the rope, snapping his neck instantly and dying before the crowd had a chance to enjoy his suffering. It was a small act of defiance, but a perfectly calculated one. English law required that traitors be hanged until nearly dead, then cut down for the real punishment of disembowelment and dismemberment. By killing himself during the hanging, Guy Fawkes cheated the executioner and the crowd of the gruesome spectacle they'd come to see. The crowd reacted with the kind of outrage normally reserved for cancelled festivals or rained-out sporting events. They'd waited hours to watch Guy Fawkes die slowly and horribly, and he'd denied them their entertainment by dying quickly and quietly. Some shouted their disappointment. Others demanded that the executioner continue with the quartering anyway, which he did, though the impact was considerably diminished when performed on a corpse. The executioner, being a professional, completed the sentence as prescribed by law. Guy Fawkes's body was duly quartered and the pieces distributed for display around London. But the gesture felt anticlimactic. The crowd had come to see suffering, and they'd been given only death. They'd expected hours of entertainment, and they'd received only minutes of disappointment. Guy Fawkes's body was duly quartered, and the pieces distributed for display around London, but the gesture felt anticlimactic. The man who'd spent his life planning dramatic failures had managed one final dramatic success, denying his enemies the satisfaction of watching him suffer. His death was immediately controversial. Protestant commentators praised his final repentance and quick death as evidence of divine mercy toward a sinner who'd recognized his errors. Catholic observers saw his escape from prolonged torture as a sign of heavenly favor toward a martyr who'd died for the true faith. Government officials were simply annoyed that their carefully planned demonstration of justice had been undermined by the prisoner's refusal to cooperate with his own execution. But Guy Fawkes was beyond caring about anyone's opinions. He'd lived his adult life in service of a cause he believed was righteous, died for that cause when it failed, and managed to frustrate his enemies even in death. For a man who'd devoted himself to spectacular failures, this was probably the best possible ending. The other conspirators were forgotten within a generation. Their names survived only in historical records and legal documents. But Guy Fawkes, who'd jumped when he should have suffered, who'd died quickly when he was supposed to die slowly, who'd frustrated justice when he was supposed to satisfy it, became something more than a failed terrorist. He became a legend. Not a good legend exactly, but a memorable one. And in England, where people appreciate good theatre almost as much as they appreciate spectacular failures, that was quite enough to ensure immortality. 400 years later, Guy Fawkes is probably the only failed terrorist in history whose defeat is celebrated annually with parties, fireworks, and children's songs. Every November 5th, Britain commemorates the Gunpowder Plot with Guy Fawkes Night, a peculiar holiday that combines patriotic celebration, macabre entertainment, and the kind of gleeful historical amnesia that turns attempted mass murder into family fun. The celebration began immediately after the plot's discovery, when Parliament declared November 5th a day of thanksgiving for the kingdom's deliverance from Catholic conspiracy. Churches held special services praising divine providence for protecting Protestant England from foreign passionate terrorism. Bells rang throughout London in celebration of the government's survival. Bonfires were lit to symbolise the purification of the realm and the triumph of religious truth over foreign error. These early celebrations were serious affairs, genuine expressions of relief that the government had survived and the true religion had been preserved. Sermons focused on divine providence and royal protection, emphasising that God himself had intervened to save Protestant England from Catholic destruction. Official proclamations emphasised English independence and Protestant virtue, contrasting loyal English subjects with foreign personal conspirators. The anniversary was a patriotic celebration of national survival, not a carnival of historical entertainment. The religious dimension of the early celebrations cannot be overstated. Protestant ministers used November 5th as an opportunity to demonstrate that the Gunpowder Plot had been not just a political conspiracy, but a theological abomination. Catholic plotters weren't just traitors to their king, they were enemies of God who tried to destroy his chosen people. The celebration became an annual reminder that Protestant England enjoyed divine protection against Catholic threats. But something interesting happened as the years passed and the immediate fear of Catholic plots faded into historical memory. The celebration gradually transformed from solemn thanksgiving into elaborate entertainment. Bonfires became bigger and more numerous. Fireworks were added for visual excitement, creating the ironic spectacle of explosions celebrating the prevention of an explosion. Effigies were burned for dramatic effect, allowing crowds to participate symbolically in the punishment of long-dead conspirators. And somehow, the man who'd tried to blow up Parliament became the star of his own failure festival. Guy Fawkes' effigies appeared early in the celebration's evolution, initially as symbols of defeated treachery to be burned in righteous triumph. But effigies require construction, and construction requires thought, and thinking about Guy Fawkes for several weeks each year inevitably led to a more complex relationship with the man and his crime. The process of building Guy Fawkes' effigies became a community activity that involved entire families in the commemoration of historical events they barely understood. Children gathered old clothes and newspapers to stuff their guys. Parents helped with construction techniques and safety arrangements. Neighbors competed to create the most elaborate or realistic effigies. The terrorist became a craft project, the fanatic became a family activity, and the failed conspiracy became an excuse for creative collaboration. The guy who'd tried to eliminate the government became the guide, a scarecrow-like figure that children built from old clothes and newspaper, then wheeled through the streets, begging penny for the guy before burning him on November 5th. The terrorist became a beggar, the fanatic became a puppet, and the failed conspiracy became a children's fundraising scheme that taught entrepreneurship alongside historical awareness. This transformation was uniquely English in its ability to turn historical trauma into harmless tradition. Rather than dwelling on the horror of what might have happened, the British chose to celebrate the comedy of what actually happened. A group of amateurs who spent months planning the perfect crime, only to be caught holding the evidence while standing next to their intended target. The songs that children sang while wheeling their guys through the streets captured this perfectly. Remember, remember, the 5th of November. Gunpowder, treason, and plot. I see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. These weren't serious historical ballads or patriotic anthems. They were nursery rhymes that turned political terrorism into playground entertainment. Children who couldn't explain the theological differences between Catholicism and Protestantism could recite detailed verses about Guy Fawkes' plan to blow up Parliament. The failed terrorist became as familiar as Mother Goose, and considerably more fun to burn. The rhymes themselves evolved over time, accumulating additional verses that added gruesome details about Guy Fawkes' execution and creative suggestions for his ongoing punishment. Some versions included references to hanging, drawing, and quartering that would have been perfectly comprehensible to children who witnessed public executions as routine entertainment. Modern versions tend to focus on the bonfires and fireworks rather than the historical punishments, reflecting changing attitudes toward both entertainment and child welfare. The irony was perfect and perfectly English. Guy Fawkes had wanted to be remembered as the man who destroyed the Protestant establishment and restored Catholic rule to England. Instead, he was remembered as the man who failed so completely that his failure became a national joke. He'd sought martyrdom and achieved absurdity. He'd planned for religious revolution and inspired children's games. But the celebration evolved beyond simple mockery into something more complex and historically significant. Guy Fawkes Night became an annual demonstration of national unity, a shared ritual that brought together Protestant and Catholic, rich and poor, urban and rural, in common celebration of their country's survival. Whatever their differences, all English people could agree that blowing up Parliament was wrong and that failure deserved mockery. The holiday also served as a safety valve for political dissent. Burning effigies of Guy Fawkes provided a socially acceptable way to express hostility toward authority without actually challenging authority. Citizens could spend weeks planning elaborate displays of symbolic violence, then discharge their frustrations in harmless celebration. Revolution became recreation, terrorism became theatre, and political anger became community entertainment. Modern Guy Fawkes Night celebrations demonstrate the holiday's remarkable adaptability to changing social and political conditions. The basic elements remain unchanged: bonfires, fireworks, and effigy burning, but the meaning and context continue to evolve. Some celebrations emphasize historical education, using the anniversary to teach children about 17th century politics and religious conflicts. Others focus on community building, bringing neighbors together for shared entertainment that has nothing to do with Guy Fawkes or the Gunpowder Plot. Modern Guy Fawkes Night bears little resemblance to the original Thanksgiving celebrations, but it serves the same essential function. It transforms historical trauma into shared entertainment. The bonfires are bigger, the fireworks are more spectacular, and the guys are more elaborate, but the basic appeal remains unchanged. People gather to celebrate the time when the government almost got blown up, but didn't. The commercial aspects of modern Guy Fawkes Night would probably astonish the original conspirators. Fireworks manufacturers plan their entire year around November 5th. Retailers stock special Guy Fawkes merchandise. Local authorities organise elaborate public displays that cost thousands of pounds and attract tens of thousands of spectators. The failed terrorist has become the foundation of a seasonal economy that generates millions in revenue while commemorating his defeat. This is perhaps the strangest form of immortality imaginable. Guy Fawkes isn't remembered for what he accomplished. He accomplished nothing. He isn't remembered for his noble sacrifice. His sacrifice achieved nothing. He isn't even remembered for his theological convictions. Most people who burn his effigy couldn't explain the religious disputes that motivated his plot. He's remembered for his failure, and his failure is remembered with affection. In a world where successful terrorists are forgotten within decades and failed revolutionaries disappear into historical footnotes, Guy Fawkes has achieved something remarkable. He's become lovable. Not admirable, not inspiring, not heroic, but lovable, in the way that all spectacular failures eventually become lovable when enough time has passed and the consequences have faded. Every November 5th, millions of people gather around bonfires to watch Guy Fawkes burn again. Children build his effigy with the same enthusiasm they'd show for Christmas decorations. Adults plan elaborate fireworks displays to commemorate his defeat. Families share traditional foods and songs that celebrate his failure. The man who wanted to destroy England with gunpowder has become England's most beloved failure. And somewhere in all that smoke and fire and laughter, the man who wanted to destroy England with gunpowder finally achieved his goal of being remembered forever. Just not quite the way he'd planned. The fuse was never lit, the government never fell, and England never returned to Catholicism, but Guy Fawkes got his explosion after all. 4 centuries of small explosions, lighting up November skies in celebration of the most famous failure in British history. Sleep well, and remember, some failures are so perfect that they become traditions. Some defeats are so complete that they become victories. And some men who try to destroy their country end up being celebrated by that country forever, even if the celebration involves setting them on fire once a year. Pleasant dreams, and don't let the gunpowder plots bite. The real ones never work out quite as planned anyway. They collapse under the weight of human incompetence, betrayed by conscience, and undone by the simple truth that keeping secrets is harder than keeping promises. And keeping promises is impossible when the promise involves committing mass murder in the name of God. Sweet dreams, and remember, the 5th of November, when nothing exploded, everything survived, and failure became a national treasure worth preserving in smoke and flame for all eternity. When a man who spent his life learning to destroy things discovered that the most lasting destruction is sometimes accomplished by failing completely, spectacularly, and memorably. Thank you for listening, one last time. May your sleep be deep, your dreams quiet, and your mind at peace. Good night.